Morning, everybody. Good afternoon for you in Cologne. It is election day today in the United States, so I hope that at the end of the day I'm in as good mood as I'm at the beginning of the day. So we'll see what the voting participation will bring us. Today I'm going to end this section of the class with a move from static allocation problems to dynamic allocation problems. So if you remember, so far the auction, the assignments, the allocation problems, the decision problems that we look on had all were basically all phrased as static problems. That is, even though the auction sort of followed a two-step procedure, that is, we first set up the marketplace and then we have the bidders interact in the marketplace, say, had otherwise a perfectly static perspective. That is, we were thinking of a single allocation of a single unit good or generalizations thereof, but we never had the agents think about how their decision today would influence their decision tomorrow, or how the information they gather today might help them make a better and more informed decision tomorrow. And that's certainly a natural starting point. But as you know from your own life, life is inherently dynamic, and doing things today will influence what our possibilities, our opportunities tomorrow. And gathering information today will be helpful for us to make better decisions tomorrow. So to the extent that that is true, it is also true in market design. That is, a lot of issues are inherently dynamic. If you think about the sponsored search auction, then advertisers clearly seek to essentially run campaigns, advertising campaigns over a certain time horizon. And the budget spent today or the budget spent this month will influence how much of a budget they will have available next month. So dynamic consideration clearly come into play. And so in the first lecture today, I want to think about extending the canonical framework of the Vickrey-Groves-Clark mechanism to account for intertemporal aspects. And in the first lecture, in fact, I will talk about efficient allocations and how to sustain and to support efficient allocations. So we'll basically take the view of maximizing social welfare. And then in the second lecture, after the break, we will talk about dynamic allocation problems, but now with a focus on optimal, maximum revenue mechanisms, again, that spread out over time. So there's a clear distinction. In the first lecture, we think about efficient allocation. In the second, we think about revenue maximizing allocations. That distinction would be important. And I should also note that I gave you a set of additional annotated papers, background material to read. These are all papers that I recommend because they give a clear exposition of the basic theory, much better than you could expect from a textbook in many cases. And so some of them will be survey articles that appeared in the leading journals. And at some points, I also referred you to outstanding treatments in textbooks, and you find that as well. So this gives you a first introduction into the material. And so for today, we're going to start out with a paper that Juuso Alimäki at Aalto University in Helsinki and I wrote. That's called the dynamic pivot mechanism. And then in the second lectures, we will focus our treatment of revenue maximizing mechanisms around a very influential paper by Courtine Lee called Sequential Screening. I have also recommended you a survey article that Juuso and I wrote on the entire area of research that has been very active over the 10 last years, and then is also still of ongoing interest to many people, so that might be helpful to read as well. Good. So let's see. Dynamic mechanism, dynamic allocations are quite natural. One is that the bidding and the allocations may not be present at the very beginning, but rather they may arrive randomly over time. So we want to think and allow for a situation where buyers, sellers, and the object may arrive over time, dynamically, and possibly in a random manner. Why is that relevant? Well, think about selling seats on an airplane. So, of course, sort of a pre-COVID example. We're not going onto airplanes anymore, but let's stick with this, right? So, I'm planning to leave to see my family over the Thanksgiving holidays, so the winter holidays, the Christmas holidays. I have to plan to book a ticket, but when I will book it, when I'll be thinking, and when I will have more information and what's the destination, what's the exact time frame that I'm looking at, that it will be typically random. Okay. If I'm thinking of purchasing an object on eBay, then that will be random because my participation may be random. And it is also the case that the object may arrive in a predictable or less predictable manner. And of course, I may sometimes lose outcomes in eBay. So the actual time when I will be able to get the object will be random. Okay. If you think about contractors bidding for construction project that is taking part in public building projects, building highways, building trains, building railroads, and so on, then these construction projects are going to come online with an uncertain time because they have to undergo review and approval by the public authorities. Okay. And likewise, the bidders may or may not have capacity to actually support building the project because they may be committed or maybe not committed to other projects already. Okay, we talked about bidding and sponsored search, such as Google and Yahoo. Okay, there maybe there's no question about the randomness, but rather there is an issue about additional information arriving through the bidding process, right? So if you think about the advertisers, the bidders for the sponsored search links as the ones who would like to provide their links to the users, then they may be initially uncertain of what the click-through rate is. They may be uncertain about what the conversion rate is by which they're turning the clicks into sales, which is after all what they're interested in. And so if I'm going to bid on the engine, then not only do I get from the bid an impact on my chance of showing a link today, but I'm also learning something about how valuable it is to be actually placing a link on the website. Okay. The final example, if you want to think about leasing a resource over time, right? So think about a web serving, a computation resource, bandwidth, CPU, okay? Then you're facing an intertemporal problem, okay? You face a question of how quickly do you want to run the computational job, how costly this is to get it done instantaneously, get it done the same day, get it done overnight, get it done within the week. You are competing for the bandwidth with other firms, and so the question is how is that being organized and what are the outcomes that we attain. Okay, if you think even about simpler things, simply renting a property, say a real estate property for a store, then by renting today, you clearly not only have the rights to serve that store today, but you also gain insights into what is the customer population, what is the traffic at that site, and it will give you valuable information as to whether you want to renew that license or that right, that lease in the next period. And it will naturally change your position in the bidding context tomorrow. Okay. So these are just examples where it's actually either the participation that is random, where the information changes over time, or where the allocation may change over time. All of these are aspects that we want to model, that we want to account for, and that we want to think about. Okay. Let me just remind you that we looked in the beginning at the problem of how can we maintain an efficient, or how can we generate, how can we support an efficient allocation in a static environment. The leading papers there were the ones by Big Creek, Clark, and Groves. And that's for that reason that we refer to the acronym BCG as representing these three authors that establish incentive compatibility and dominance strategies in private value environments. And the way it's done is by having each agent, through the structure of the transfers, internalize the social objective. So even though a priori, each bidder is only interested in being his own private net utility, by setting the transfers in such a way, we are in a situation of actually internalizing the social externality. Okay, Clark in particular, and then Lafont later on, defined a specific VCG mechanism that was referred to by Lafont as pivotal mechanism. And that's the one that we're going to work with today, or that we're going to try to generalize to dynamic setting. Let me remind you that what was key here was the notion of an externality cost. Okay, so we said the externality that an agent is imposing on all the other agents is simply the difference in the sum of the utilities that accrue to all the agents but I. And when we take the difference over the two events that either agent I is absent or agent I is present. Okay, so if agent I is absent, we're going to pursue the optimal thing in the presence of agent I, and that will give them typically a higher utility than what they will do when agent I is present. So this difference will typically be negative. Will typically be positive. So that means there is an externality cost for agent I. So we're going to say this is positive. Okay, and therefore, agent I will have to pay something. Okay, but to the extent that he does pay this externality cost, he indeed internalizes his impact on the social objective. And what we're trying, or what is achieved in the pivot mechanism in the static setting, is that every agent is getting his marginal contribution to the social surplus. So this is going to be the key notion today. Namely, he gets his gross utility, that is simply the utility that occurs to him before making payments. So by gross utility, we mean the utility before making payments, and by net utility, we mean the utility that arises after making the payments. What we think of the marginal contribution of I is simply his gross utility minus the externality cost that imposes on all the others. So this is a classic marginal condition that gives us, or that we hope will give us, efficiency. Okay. So that is where we're going to start. And I want to emphasize two things. So I want to emphasize that we are going to stay for today in what is called a private value environment. So that means the ability of each agent to assess the value of the allocation depends only on his own private information and does not depend on any information that the others may have. Okay. And as we go from a static to a dynamic world, there will be two questions. The first question that we're going to ask, will it be possible to get an implementation, get an equilibrium in dominant strategy? So this is question number one. Okay. And question number two that we're going to ask is, will it be possible for us to attain a net utility, an equilibrium utility of the bidders that reflects a marginal contribution. Okay, good. And so when we speak about the dynamic pivot mechanism today, then it is precisely that that objective, that we want to implement a mechanism that gives every agent his marginal contribution, but now of course it's the marginal contribution to the entire intertemporal environment, okay? And we want to consider a broad class of intertemporal environments where we have new information arriving, both with respect to preferences, with respect to the participating agent, and with respect to the allocation that are available. And what we're trying to do here is to design a sequence of payments, right? We're going to get an intertemporal allocation that is one that specifies in every period what every agent gets and what he has to pay in order to get that flow of services or that flow of products. We're going to design a sequence of payment so that in at each moment, every agent receives something that we're going to call a flow marginal contribution. Okay. Good. And of course, we will have to define what we mean by it. Okay. Now, the sounds quite natural, okay? And so in some sense, what we're going to do is we're going to try to solve an intertemporal problem as a completely contingent plan. Okay, so that is, it is as if you're looking all the way into the future, we're specifying all the possible contingencies, and we're simply thinking about making choices at every contingency, where now we think about the contingency both as a time period, number one, as a time period, but also as a particular state of the world that is going to be realized. So the best way to think about this is basically as an event tree that unfolds over time into the future. Okay, so think about this as an event tree. Okay, and a very famous result by Arrow and De Breu in the 50s and the 60s in the context of a general equilibrium analysis said that one can indeed embed every intertemporal problem into a static problem and basically solve the complicated dynamic allocation problem as this is a static problem. Okay, and so you might pause for a second and say, well, with this analogy, with this comparison, why have we not done all of the important work in the analysis of the static environment? And why is it not, why basically can we not simply refer to those results and end the discussion here? Okay. And well, good or bad, depending on your perspective and your point of view, but I think good and interesting for us today is that this contingent view, so this strict translation of the Arrow-De Breu analysis fails because it fails to take into account the strategic possibility of the agents in the sequential model. Okay, what do I mean by that? Is that private information was completely absent in the Arrow-De Breu setting. Okay, and therefore there was no notion or there was no constraint of incentive compatibility, that is getting the agents to reveal the information truthfully. What is critical when we go to sequential models, dynamic models, intertemporal models, is that the agent now has a very rich set of strategic opportunities. Why? Because when he's thinking of reporting truthfully, he not only can report truthfully, but he can also choose to misrepresent his preferences. And when he does so, he can do so by not only misreporting today, but thinking about how that might lead him to choose a different reporting strategy tomorrow. Okay, so this means we not only have to keep track of single shot deviation, but we also have to keep track of multiple deviation. These multiple deviations come with the sequential nature of the model and cannot be translated into a static model simply because they don't capture the full richness or the full combinatorial possibilities, if you wish, that I as an agent have, right? I can misrepresent here, I can misrepresent here, I can misrepresent here. And so I have an entire sequence of possible reporting strategies that I cannot represent in a static environment. Okay. And so while the analogy might be helpful and tells us what might be a useful benchmark, it will not allow us to get to a complete solution. Okay. As the information arrives over time, the report of agent I responds to his private information at that time, okay? But it can also respond to past reports that he may make, or to past reports that other agents may make. And therefore, typically, we will not be able to get truth tooling to be guaranteed or secured under dominant strategies or under weakly dominant strategies. Okay, so the first failure, sort of, if you wish, or the first point to remark here is that we will not get dominant strategy implementation, we will not get dominant strategy equilibrium, and we have therefore to ask ourselves, what is it that we can attain? Second, with forward-looking agents, we want to require that the participation constraint is not just satisfied in period 0, but it's satisfied in all future periods. That is, whenever I'm arriving at a period, looking forward, the interaction that the mechanism, that the market offers to me, okay, needs to be such that I'm willing to continue participating from then on. Okay, and so this is the second point that we need to be aware of. We want to guarantee that the participation constraint is met. Okay? Excellent. So let me give you just a brief snapshot of what I'm going to try to establish for you and what I'm going to show you today. And then we're heading right into a statement of the model, and then we're starting with the analysis. Okay, so we're going to show you that a dynamic version of the pivot mechanism is going to allow us to implement the allocation in a socially efficient manner. This is sort of a surprising result given the complexity of dynamic decisions. We're going to weaken, that is, we're going to have an notion of incentive constraint that is weaker than dominant strategy in the sense that it's more permissive, but it shares many of the features, and we're going to refer to that as exposed equilibrium, and moreover as periodic exposed equilibrium, because we're going to think about all the information that we have gathered until period t, okay, until period t, but we of course do not have access to information into the future. And so what we're going to show is that we will be able to satisfy exposed incentive constraint and exposed participation constraint. Okay. And with an additional condition on the nature of the equilibrium and the structure of the payments over time, an exit condition or an online condition, we can in fact uniquely identify the dynamic pivot mechanism. Okay. And the exit condition is simply say, if agent I doesn't impact future allocative decision, that is, if his information, no matter in which direction it is going, will not change the nature of future decision, then agent I should also not have either positive or negative monetary transfer. So if he's going to be immaterial or inessential for the allocative decision, then he should be also immaterial or inessential for the monetary decisions. Okay. So this is the direction that we're going to head today. And I want you to just know a little bit of the background. So there's actually a beautiful paper by Dolan in '78. He was later the dean of the business school in Michigan and then in Chicago. on priority queuing that anticipated many of the issues that come with dynamic allocation without yet formulating as a mechanism problem. A very nice paper by David Parks from Harvard in computer science thought about dynamic allocation and what he referred to as a delayed BCG mechanism. And in an earlier paper with you, so we thought about a complete information version of the game that we're analyzing today, where we think about repeatedly allocation of selling a single object over time. There, the notion of marginal contribution already arose naturally, and we could maintain an equilibrium. So first price bidding today, of course, we're going to use the mechanics of the mechanism design literature, in particular the direct mechanism language. Okay, and then a very interesting paper by Susan Essie and Ilya Siegel focused on the notion of balanced budget. So a mechanism as does Prémont-Gérard-Varé had first suggested it, rather than participation constraints that we are going to look at today. But they covered much the same ground in terms of the general specification of the environment. All right. I think with this we can start now to present the model. I think the only one who is live, that is at least can speak and is unmuted, is Simon. So hi, Simon. Otherwise, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. You should use that occasion. But otherwise, I'm going to now present the model. Okay. I'm thinking, in fact, before I'm presenting you the general model, I'm going to give you a specific instance of a dynamic allocation problem to get you a little bit familiar with the issues that arise with the mathematics and with the economics that arise, okay? So here's the problem, and that is a generalization of the paper that I mentioned by Dolan. I want to think about scheduling tasks, okay? So we have a long horizon, possibly infinite, and we have a discount factor that is shared by all of the agents. And there are finitely many agents, okay? So each agent has a single task, and he has a value for the task if he were to be able to secure the realization of that task instantaneously or at the very beginning. And then he has a quasi-linear utility, which is simply the value of the task minus the price, okay? And the only issue is that this task needs access to a resource. So think about a computational resource. And this computational resource is limited. That is, we just have 1 unit per time. So if we have these agents, then we basically want them to be arranged over time in an order so that we are going to try to complete all of this tasks as quickly as possible. But what needs to be decided is what's the order, how should they be ranked, okay? Okay, so think about this now. We basically have a timeline that is okay, we're basically starting at t equal to 0 and we're moving along t equal to 1. Okay, my pen seems to fall asleep if I'm not using it all the time, so let me try to reconnect it and maybe get better connection. Okay. But it is not working quite as nicely as I was hoping to. In any case, this is the issue that we want to address, okay? So we basically have a sequence of times and a sequence of tasks. And if you think about it, it's quite natural to order the tasks now simply in descending orders of values. It is the most valuable task we should start at. The next valuable task we should then follow up with, and so on, okay? In the absence of any monetary transfers or any payment that the bidders make for the task, it would be, of course, hopeless to attain this allocation, because everybody would claim that they have a very valuable task and that they want to go first. Okay, so it's clear that we need prices to somehow set the incentive right and manage to sort the tasks over time in an incentive compatible and efficient way. Okay, and so let's do that, precisely that. That is, let's simply for the moment think about a complete information environment, so where we know what the values are, and all that we want to do is to guarantee the efficient allocation of the tasks over time. Okay, so let's simply take all the values, let's order them in descending order. Okay, and then ask what's the natural way in which we want to think about the contribution that every task or every person, right? So every person has just one task. So every person is basically identified with this task. What's the contribution that the tasks make? Well, we know how to order it, okay? If we're going to remove a task, okay, we are simply going to be able to move through the remaining task a little bit faster, okay? And so that is what I'm presenting here, okay? That is, if indeed agent I is present, then he comes into position slot I. But if he were not present, then at that point, we would already be able to move with agent I plus 1, okay? And then, of course, accelerate and go through the other task faster. And the way we're going to go through them faster is basically by postponing or accelerating the realizations of the task. Okay, and that's what is happening here. Okay, right. And so we can therefore ask, what is the marginal contribution that agent I is bringing to society? Okay. And just as before in a static setting, what we're looking at is simply a comparison between the value that we can attain with agent I and the value that we can attain without agent I. Okay, so what is it that we attain with agent I? Well, with agent I, we're simply going through the task in the order that we meant to do. Okay, and so what you see here is the discounting that happens, and that raises delta to the power of t is perfectly synchronized with the tasks that are happening in period t. Okay, the difference that we're going to look at is simply going to say, well, what would we do without agent I? And without agent I, nothing would change until we come to the position of agent I, that is, we have exactly the same sequence, but thereafter, we're simply going to accelerate. We're going to go through the task by one period faster than we otherwise would be able to do, okay? So you see now the time indices here, t and t minus 1 are not perfectly synchronized anymore. They are offset by 1 unit, which means task t can actually be done not at t, but one period before, namely t minus 1. Okay. If I'm now going to find an expression for this difference, okay, then what you see is I'm going to basically have an expression about the differences in the value and the differences in the value between any two adjacent slots, any two adjacent tasks, is going to be weighted by the discount factor. That is how quickly that delay is going to happen. So we basically have the product between the weight, which is a discount factor, and the differences in the utility that comes from I being there and I not being there. And whenever I is being there, we are essentially going to get a higher realization in all periods starting at I, okay, until thereafter, okay, but importantly not before, because the presence of I doesn't change our ordering of the most valuable tasks, those that come before I. It only changes it for those that come after I, okay? Okay. So the notion of marginal contribution, therefore, is just as transparent in a dynamic setting as it is in a static setting. And in this particular queuing problem that we're looking at here, it is basically just capturing the delay or anticipation or acceleration that comes in the assignment of more valuable tasks. Okay, so notice now that the impact that I has is propagated all the way down the line, starting at I all the way down to agent I. Okay, so I guess the secret is for me to always charge. Okay, good. So now we have the notion of marginal contribution, at least in the context of the queuing model. Now we think about how to price the externalities. Okay, right? So what's the externality? Okay, well, we want to make sure, okay, that the price that we are charging is such that the agent then receives in equilibrium as his net utility is marginal contribution. So this equality here, okay, that we're giving, this inequality mi, okay, now we are getting a boycott from my slide again. This equality here basically gives us the expression for the price. Okay, so rearranging it, okay, we're seeing that the externality cost of task I is something that looks very much like what we would see in a second price auction, namely the price that agent I has in order to get task I is simply the value that the next lower task would realize as, okay? But in this dynamic context, that's a little bit too much to ask for, okay? Because by placing task I in slot I or in time I, we are not going to remove the possibility to realizing task I plus 1. We are just going to remove the possibility of realizing it at time I. Okay? Therefore, we're going to have to take away from the price PI a discount, and the discount is precisely what I have here. Okay. Good. So task I directly replaces task I plus 1, but it raises the future value of all the tasks, and hence we want it to be less than the original price. Excellent. So now we basically know how it should work out in a setting with complete information. Of course, that's a setting when we don't think about incentive compatibility, but it gives us an information about how we should charge the price. Okay, actually, let me just remind you of one more thing. When you look at the price here and what we charge in agent I, and you're going to look at what's the information that we need in order to set the price, then what you find is that that price only refers to values that differ from the value of agent I. Okay, so that means that in order to determine the price that agent I should pay for his task, we do not need information from agent I. And so this is similar to what we can do in a static setting. That is similar to what we can do in a dominant strategy setting, because the price will be independent of the information that agent I gives to us. Okay. Okay. So we want to know whether these prices that we have computed that only use information from agents other than I will allow us to get efficient sorting, will therefore allow us to get a socially efficient allocation over time. Okay, so what we're asking ourselves is agent I has a value. If he announces his value correctly, okay, he basically wins against everybody who comes in terms of the value after him. Okay. And what we want to make sure is that when he announces a value, and with that value claims a position, so then he would like to announce a value truthfully and would always want to displace anybody who has a value that is lower than him. Okay. So remember, in the Vickrey-Groves-Clark mechanism, my announcement, that is my reporting of the type, may determine the allocation, but it will not determine the price that I have to pay in order to get that allocation. What's the allocation here? The allocation here is securing a slot before somebody else. Okay, so think about that. Let's suppose I'm person I. I want to secure a slot against person J. That is the person, okay, who has a value, okay, who has a value that is Vj, okay. I could alternatively also try to secure a slot not against Vj, but against Vj plus 1, okay. That would come with different prices, okay. And that is what this inequality is, okay. When is it that I would like to win against Vj rather than Vj plus 1? Well, that is if and only if my value is in fact already larger than the value of Vj, okay. Because if I'm going to basically solve for this inequality, then all the terms will cancel out, right? So what you recognize is that in particular, the sum is simply a telescopic expression that traces out the differences in the future. These terms will all cancel out, and all that is left is an expression for the cost of delay. That is what I have to pay. But if the cost of delay is higher for me, okay, if 1 minus delta, which is the cost of delay by 1 period, is higher for me than it's for the opponent Vj, then in fact the inequality holds. And that is when I want to guarantee myself the position and beat out not only Vj plus 1, but in fact beat out Vj. Okay. And in this argument now, what we did assume was that all the other agents have already reported their type truthfully. And that is precisely the notion of an equilibrium that we're going to use here. Namely, we're going to think about an equilibrium in which I want to report my type truthful if and only if, okay, the others are also reporting truthfully, okay. And we're going to refer, and that has been referred to, actually Lafont, Green and Lafont coined this notion in the late 70s, early 80s, as an exposed equilibrium. Okay, because even after knowing what the signal realizations of the others, the type information of the others were, I have an incentive to report truthfully, even if they did so as well. Okay, so it is not a Bayesian or an interim notion, because I don't have to form expectation about what the others reporting. My strategy of reporting truthfully is the best thing I can do if the others report truthfully, and it remains the best thing to do if I were to know what those reports are. And so that's why we refer to this as exposed, because it's after knowing what the other realized types were. Okay. Okay. So this basically concludes the analysis of the simple queuing model. But this analysis allowed us to think about the key notions. It allowed us to think about the notion of marginal contribution. It allows us to think about the appropriate transfers in this intertemporal context. And it allowed us to think about the appropriate equilibrium notion, the appropriate incentive compatibility notion, which we determined is going to be exposed. Okay. And with that at hand, we now have a pretty good pathway and idea of how we're going to generalize these results to general environment. And that's what we're going to do next. Okay. So here's the general model that we want to spend the next half hour or so. We have a finite set of agents. We have time that is discrete and evolves in steps. We have a common discount factors among the agents, and that's delta. And we have in every period a quasi-linear flow utility of agents. Okay, there's an allocation to be made, and the state that in which each agent finds himself, that is his private information, is theta, and that moves according to a Markovian process. That is, the state today and the action today is going to determine the likely state tomorrow through a stochastic kernel or through a conditional probability distribution. Okay. So the allocation problem that we are looking at is one where in every period we are determining both the allocation in every period t and the transfer t. Okay. Right. So this is a quite natural generalization of the queuing model. Okay. And we're going to focus on direct mechanism, just as we did in the static mechanism, and we can again refer to a revelation principle which said this is without loss of generality to think about direct mechanism, where we're just asking the agents directly for the information, and where we're going to think about incentive compatibility as one where reporting the information truthfully is going to be incentive compatible. Okay. Okay. So a history of publicly observable report is then simply a sequence of past histories and current reports. So that's R1 to Ri. And the socially efficient allocation basically takes on all the information that the agent have given us until that moment and makes an allocation across 0 and 1. So we're going to think here essentially about repeated allocation of a single unit good, but we can generalize this. Okay. And the transfer and pricing rules is simply determined as a matter of all of the private information that we have gathered so far into the real line. Okay. We need to be a little bit careful when we define what are strategies and what are histories, because there is, on the one hand side, the private history of agent I, who observes all the signals that he observes, all of his private information in the past and in the present, and then, of course, all of the publicly available reports. Okay. And a reporting strategy for agent I is simply going to be a mapping from that private history into the states of the worlds. Okay. He evaluates the payoff as a expected discounted utility maximizer. That is, he's simply maximizing the expected utility weighted by the discount factor delta raised to the power t of the utility minus the prices you have to pay. Okay, and so now a reporting strategy for an individual agent simply solves a sequential decision problem. So now we have to think about a value function or the dynamic program where I'm aware as agent I that my report today, okay, the RIT, has an influence not only on the current utility VIT and the price I have to pay, but may also influence the value that I'm gathering in the future. Okay, and when we think about taking expectation here, then we think about expectation. Just see whether I can change this and whether this changes the responsiveness of my pen, but it does not apparently. Okay. Good. When we take expectation, then of course we take expectation with respect to the reports of the other. This is when agent I makes a report today, then he does not yet know what the report of the other agent is. Okay. Okay, and so when we think about the history, in particular history of the others, then we think about the history of all the agents except agents I reporting today. Okay? Because when agent I is forming his best response, he does not, he knows his own report, but he does not yet know what the others said. Okay. If we were to think about Bayesian incentive compatibility, so now we want to speak about what is the appropriate equilibrium notion, or what is the, my apologies, what is the appropriate notion for incentive compatibility, then a standard objective would be to think about Bayesian incentive compatibility, okay, which is simply saying that I want to choose a report that maximizes my expected utility over all time periods, okay. If I'm strengthening the incentive constraints and I'm saying, well, I want it to be incentive compatible with respect to all the information purity, that is including the report of agents I, then I'm going to say it is a periodic exposed incentive compatible mechanism, okay? And that's the notion that we're going to think about today, okay? Excellent. Okay, so now we are at the position where we can really describe what the pivotal mechanism is going to look like. And to this, we need to give you a general definition of the notion of a marginal contribution, okay? So remember, the marginal contribution is basically comparing the social value in the presence of I minus the social value in the absence of I, okay? So if at any point in time, let's call this U, we are disregarding, in fact, removing agent I, then we can simply have a problem that maximizes the social program for all of the remaining agents, okay? And we want to think about the marginal contribution that agent I makes as simply the difference between the value of the social program in the presence minus the social value in the absence of agent I, okay? Now notice that here in the moment we are talking about the entire social value over the entire future stream of decisions. So this W is not a single static utility, but is rather the value function of the social problem, okay? When we're making decisions today, we are influencing the state tomorrow, okay? And therefore, we're influencing what the marginal contribution of agent I is. So if we say that the marginal contribution of I in state theta t plus 1 is conditioned on the decision AT, then we're thinking about what's the value that we are likely to get after we make a decision AT today, okay? And with this conditional future value, we now have a way to not only think about the entire marginal contribution looking from today into the future, we also have a way to think about what is the marginal contribution that agent I makes in that very period. That is his flow marginal contribution, okay? That is small mi, okay? And we're going to say that small mi is simply the term that arises when we think about the marginal contribution recursively. That is, if today we're going to choose the efficient allocation, that is denoted by AT star, and then continue assigning agent I in the future his marginal contribution. Everything that is not captured by this future continuation contribution has to be his flow marginal contribution. So it's in some sense the current residual that agent I should get. Okay. Okay, so let me parse that for you and let me give you a slightly more explicit and direct description of that flow marginal contribution. Okay. So we start out with the flow marginal contribution, which is a small mi, and we're going to now expand the big mi's and write them in terms of their differences. Okay, so the first term, therefore, is simply the marginal contribution starting at t. And the second term is simply the marginal contribution starting one period later, therefore discounted by delta, and conditional on undertaking the efficient decision today. Okay. And now what you see is that, of course, in the differences, we're comparing, in some sense, apples and oranges, namely the social value in the presence and the social value in the absence of I. So let's rearrange that one more time so that what we compare is simply the social value in the presence of I and the social value in the absence of I. What we then get is simply that the flow marginal contribution has a very natural expression as a differences of two differences, namely one, the contribution that he makes today to the efficient problem, and the other, the externality caused by directing the allocation towards the efficient allocation today, when really we are just thinking about society without I. Okay. So that second term, okay, is in some sense the externality cost of agent I. And the externality cost comes in two forms. It comes in the form of basically distorting the allocation away from what would be the efficient allocation in the absence of I to securing the efficient allocation in the presence of I. Okay. Good. And the big result of this lecture today is the result that we can implement the socially efficient allocation rule, okay, in a way that we satisfy ex post incentive constraint and ex post participation constraint with a payment rule, okay, that basically guarantees the agent in each period his flow marginal contribution. Okay, so we notice here that we can compute the marginal contribution in some sense outside of the mechanism, that is before thinking about incentive compatibility, right? It is just a term that expresses social value. So it is basically a welfare computation. And once we have done that welfare computation, then we have enough information to tell us what the price has to be. It has to precisely reflect the difference between the gross value of the agent and the flow marginal contribution. Okay, so the key here was that there is an exact translation, or if you wish, generalization of the static pivot mechanism to a dynamic environment, and that was enabled by the right notion of a marginal contribution temporalized, that is written in terms of flow terms, as we just did. Okay. So we get an efficient allocation, we can get a marginal contribution pricing, okay? But in contrast to the static environment, in the dynamic environment, we cannot guarantee dominant strategy incentive compatibility, as the agents have the ability to respond to past announcement. Yet we can get something weaker, which is what we refer to as ex post incentive compatibility. Okay. I will actually suggest to Emanuele to give you an example of the difference between dominant and ex post incentive compatibility in dynamic settings, to make sure that you see how the discrepancy between dominant and dominant strategy and exposed incentive compatibility emerges. Okay? And the idea here is that a misreport by the agents today, by some agents today, is basically a way of colluding against any particular agent. And as collusion is possible and may yield higher revenues in dynamic settings and violate dominant strategy incentive compatibility. Okay. Good. Let me pause here for a second and make the following observation. So typically, when we think about the socially efficient allocation, then this will be determined by a maximization problem. In well-behaved, nice maximization problem, we will typically get a unique determination of what the appropriate allocation is. Yes. That's not quite true when we think about the payments, right? The payments really matter in terms of the impact on the utility, not so much in terms of what we're asking each agent to pay today, but what we're asking each agent to pay over time in terms of a discounted sum. Okay, therefore, while we might have a unique answer to what is the efficient allocation rule, that will not typically give us a unique determination of what the unique pricing rule is or the new transfer rule is that will support the efficient allocation. Okay. What the theorem provides you is that there is at least one way in which I can posit, in which I can set the transfers that gives me a supporting transfer for the efficient allocation, but it may not be the unique one. Okay, because after all, from each agent's point of view, what he cares is not the payment that he makes in a particular moment, but it's the payment that he's making over time. So what he cares about is the entire expected discounted future stream of payments that he has to make. Okay, so that suggests that we have some leeway in moving the payments back and forth. That is, whether we are backloading, front loading, or present loading the payments, that is in some sense left undetermined by the socially efficient allocation. In particular, it's left undetermined because we assume that all of the participants, that is the seller, or the planner, and all of the agents have the same discount factor. So the way they trade off paying today versus paying tomorrow is all the same. Okay. Now, okay, what we're now going to do is to impose one additional condition, and with that, we will actually not only get a unique allocation rule, but we will get a unique transfer rule. Okay. Okay. I wanted to make two comments here. That think about that. That is, I wanted to make first a comment about the discount factor. Okay. As I just mentioned, we're going to assume that the discount factor is the same for all agents and the principal. This, in some sense, is necessary in order for us to think about a well-defined social planners problem. If any two players had to have a different discount factor, then that means we basically have a way of rearranging the payments so that both agents are made better off. It would basically mean that we have the possibility of a money pump. Okay, so because if one agent discounts the future faster, then that would suggest him being willing to pay more in the future. The other who discounts the future less fast would like to get the payment today, by pushing it further into the future, closer to the present, we're basically having more and more scope of increasing welfare, but that is just due to the differences in the discount factor. So in these models, we therefore typically will assume, in order to have a well-defined welfare set program, that the discount factor is the same. But if it's the same, then there's some undeterminacy. Okay. This temporal separation between the allocative influence and the monetary payment is undesirable for many reasons. Okay. An agent I may leave the mechanism and break her commitment after she ceases to have an influence on the allocation, right? And so if I'm expecting that there will be no influence anymore of the allocation, then why should I want to continue participating? Everything will still move on even in the absence, okay? And in particular, I may not have an interest to communicate my information, okay? And so we're going to think about making this idea formal here, and we're going to say that the presence of I is not influential for the future anymore. It's not pivotal, if you wish, for the future anymore at any particular state. If the probability that the absence of I would make a difference in terms of the actual allocation that society chooses from an efficient point of view is exactly zero. Okay. And we're going to say that any mechanism, in particular the transfer part of the mechanism, satisfy the efficient exit condition when and if an agent is not influential anymore, then he also doesn't have to pay anymore. Good. And so that basically says, if we are in an online setting, so in a setting where we're all present all the time, then only when there's a need for us to be present will we have to make payments. Okay. Okay. Good. And a second condition is that the float valuations are diverse, and by this we simply mean that for every agent there exists a state by which he's not interested in the allocation anymore. So where his gross utility is zero, and whenever that happens, then it will also remain in that state forever. So that's sort of a dormancy or an exit state, if you wish. Okay. And then there are also there are states such for any action and for any particular allocation that is being chosen, we get a particular value. Okay. So that's just the richness in terms of how rich the information is. Okay. And the uniqueness result that we have is saying that with diverse valuation, if a mechanism satisfies exposed incentive and participation constraint and the efficient exit condition, then it has to be the dynamic pivot mechanism. Okay, so that is a strong result, which basically says if we insist on this additional structural properties of the mechanism, then there's no choice left anymore, and we are basically asked to always use the dynamic pivotal mechanisms. Okay. Okay. And with that, I think you got a pretty good idea of how far we can go by extending the logic, the celebrated logic of the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism to dynamic environments, where the two defining aspects, criteria that we used here was that A, the environment is one of private values, and B, that we could use transferable utility at any moment in time. Okay, that is what gave us these strong properties for incentive compatibility. And in the design of the monetary transfers, we could rely on and were guided entirely by the notion of marginal contribution and the sequenced version of marginal contribution, one that we call flow marginal contributions. And once we had this notion in place, these were really notions that refer to the welfare program rather than the individual problem. we could transfer the insights from the pivotal mechanism to the static mechanism. There are many open issues and issues that people have studied. One interesting issue is to what extent these results that I presented here can be extended to interdependent or common value environments, and that's an ongoing area of research. I should also point out or make you think about one more thing. That's the role of commitment. Okay, so when we started out, we talked about thinking about the allocation problem that we're solving as a contingent plan, a plan that basically looks far into the future along the decision tree, and then asks the planner to implement this contingent plan at every moment in time, at every state in time. And it basically asks the planner to have the ability to fully commit to the entire plan right away from the beginning. Okay. The question that we may then ask is, do we actually need that commitment in order to implement, in order to realize the dynamic pivot mechanism? Okay, that is, let's fix the objective of the planner to be him wanting to maximize the social objective, that is, maximize the social welfare, but let him have the ability or let him not have the ability to commit. That is, in every period, he can redesign the incentives, he can redesign the allocation problem. The only thing that we want to insist is that in every period, when he looks forward, he still has in mind maximizing the social wealth. Okay. Okay. Could we weaken the commitment requirement that we impose on the principal on saying that we allow him to revise the allocation policy and the transfer policy in every period as he goes through time? And could we still maintain the efficiency? Okay. And if you reflect on that just a little bit, then you will notice that indeed that is absolutely possible. That is, if he maintains his objective and he has only the ability to commit himself to an allocation policy and a transfer policy today, then since what we did when we pursued the dynamic pivot mechanism was in every period maximizing the social welfare, then we can see that it will be possible to implement the optimal dynamic policy even without commitment, or even with a very limited commitment of just asking the principal to commit himself in every period just for the actions and the transfers in that period. Okay, so that's a substantial weakening of the commitment that comes basically from the dynamic optimality, from the sequential optimality of the dynamic program. Okay. And that's worthwhile to note, because it basically means that the agents can enter in this mechanism confident, even if they have doubts about the ability of the principal to commit himself for the entire future. Okay. This important property, namely the sequential optimality of the dynamic pivot mechanism, is something that we should keep in mind when we're now going to think about optimal revenue maximizing mechanisms, because it will be a property that typically the optimal revenue maximizing mechanism will not satisfy, and in fact often strongly violate when we're going to try to maximize the expected discounted flow of revenues. Okay, so that's basically an aide-memoire to you, sort of a thing to keep in mind when we move on to think about dynamic revenue maximizing mechanisms. Okay. It is 11:15 now, so We end 5 minutes early, but that's fine because I'm going to try to solve my software problem with my pen here one very last time. And then we're going to resume at 11:30. So we'll have a 15-minute break, which is also more appropriate, I think. Coming to the last lecture in my guest visit here to you. And I hope that you have enjoyed the lecture so far. This clearly represents a whole lot of material that we need reading, reflection, and thinking, all of which, of course, you're invited to do as students. I think you should probably start by going carefully through the slides. I spent quite a bit of time putting them together and sort of giving the essence of the results in the slides. And then afterwards, I would recommend to basically follow the treatment that is given in the paper that I refer to in the extended bibliography, and also think about the textbook treatment or the survey article treatment that I gave you alternatively. But with this, you should be then very well equipped to basically follow the results and master the material. This is all very exciting work, I think, as I mentioned at the very beginning, and let me make the point here at the very end as well. This is both material that is interesting academically and for research. This is material that people are currently working on, and this is very much at the border of, at the frontier of research. At the same time, what is really exciting about this is that even though it's clearly analytical, theoretical, conceptual in content, it is material that is being implemented, used, practiced, realized in a lot of interesting ways currently, foremost probably in the digital platform, but more and more also in other markets. And these will be markets that Peter will talk to you about: the electricity market, financial markets, the market for environmental permits and pollutions. These are all markets of incredible societal importance. And so therefore, as economists, we really ought to understand them and provide better market design for better societal outcomes. And so to the extent that as economists we can contribute to that, we really make a huge contribution to society. And then, but that only comes if we really have a firm grasp of our tools, of our material, of our insights, and can manage to convey that and condense that for public policy. Okay. Luckily today we only have to focus on understanding the basics, the fundamentals, and the implementation will be left to Peter in the next few lectures. Okay. The last lecture will be about dynamic mechanism design. The subtitle is Sequential Screening, and the subtitle is Sequential Screening, as this is the title of the paper that really started the literature, or at least gave it sort of the nicest formulation and immediate reason why we might be interested in these kinds of problems. Okay. One last hint: when you read the paper by Courtine Lee, Sequential Screening, as many good theoretical papers, they have an example, a leading example by which they develop much of their result. That leading example is really incredibly informative, helpful to understand the economics behind it, and therefore we're going to use it in a lecture, and you should also use it when reading as the guiding principle. Okay, so let me remind you just a little bit about the settings that we already had in the past lecture, but that we're going to maintain. So we're going to think about a dynamic problem. That means it includes time that evolves in discrete with either finite or an infinite time horizon. There's going to be a discount factor that we again denoted by delta. And we want to think about theta it as the value of player at time t. Okay, so this is his private information. This is what he uses as his value. And that can evolve over time. And again, it evolves according to Markov process that tells us in period t. Okay. that tells us in period t how likely it is that in period t plus 1 we're going to have a different type. Okay. These probability distributions will be type dependent. Okay. And therefore we have some persistence. That is, we can't predict what happens unless we have the current information. Okay. And I got the information from Emanuele, so I don't need to explain that. Okay. A special case is, of course, a fully persistent type, when the type today, that the willingness today is also my willingness tomorrow. And we're going to think now, we're specializing the allocation problem to one we basically want to lease or to rent the object over time. And the dynamics are going to come from the fact fall time is also the time of allergies. Okay. So the dynamics are going to come both because the valuations are going to change over time and the beliefs are going to change over time. Okay. We ended the last lecture by talking about the importance of commitment, and I want to speak just briefly about the role of commitment here by reminding you of a classic paper, namely the cost conjecture, and then a formalization of the cost conjecture that was offered in a very important paper by Gould, Sonnenschein, and Wilson in '86. And so that is an honor of our Nobel Prize winner this year, Robert Wilson. Okay, I want you to think about the situation where we have one informed buyer who has a value that is private information to him, and one uninformed seller that is going to try to elicit that information. Okay, the seller doesn't have a value for the object, the buyer has, but his valuation is in infinite horizon. We want to transact that object only once, that it needs to change hands from the seller to the buyer just once. Okay, but it can change hands either today, tomorrow, and any future period. And so let's focus for the moment on an allocation problem where we're simply going to charge a price, a posted price, at which the seller is willing to hand over the object to the buyer at period t. Okay. In the static version of the problem, that's in some sense what we saw in price discrimination, the problem would be easy. We would simply try to find that price that maximizes the expected revenue, that is the per unit price P, times the probability that we secure a sale. Okay, that is the classic monopolist problem. Okay, in the static setting. Okay, but now we're interested in the dynamic setting. Okay, in the dynamic setting, I'm going to charge a price today. Let's call that P0 as for period 0. And I'm anticipating that I also will have the occasion to sell it. If I fail to sell it today, tomorrow, which is would lead me to choose a price P1. And now I want to think as co-sort about this as a world without commitment. Okay, so I want to think about a seller who wants to maximize his revenue over time. Okay, and in fact, that revenue will come in form of just a single sale. The question is when and at what price. Okay, and we want to think about the seller who does not have the power to commit himself to an entire stream or sequence of prices, but rather has in every period the ability to rethink the problem and change his price. Okay. Now, you may ask yourself, why would he change the price? If he found an optimal price in the static problem, why would he not want to maintain that price? Well, the reason is, in this setting, by not making a sale, the seller actually learned something about the type of the buyer. And so with the additional information, he may then wish to adjust his policy to the new information. Okay, more precisely, if I set a price P0 and the buyer does not buy, in the next period, the seller will want to lower the price, where F1 is the truncated prior, because at price P0, if I set that price and it was an optimal price, it must have been that I anticipated as a seller that I'm going to sell at least to some buyers. That is, I'm going to sell at least to those buyers who have the very highest valuations and who would like to get a handle, like to control, would like to enjoy the benefit of the object as early as possible. Okay. And so therefore, the decision by the buyer is going to essentially involve a threshold policy where those with the highest valuation will buy. Those with lower valuation may want to wait with the purchase until the next period. So therefore, F1, that is the true distribution of the people who are still in the market, will actually be a truncated prior, and it's an upward truncated prior. That is, it will only include the people who have a value that is below a particular threshold. Okay. And that, in essence, is what Coase in 1937 formulated as a conjecture, beautifully argued verbally, but without any notion of sequential rationality that was made explicit with any equilibrium notion. It didn't exist at that point yet, but you can still reason completely coherently and consistently about it, and that's what he did. And that's, by the way, why he also got a Nobel Prize. And he observed that actually the monopolist who has sole control of the object actually in this world without commitment faces competition. Okay, and what's the competition? Well, it's not anybody else because there's just one seller, but it's a seller tomorrow. Okay, without the ability to commit, the seller today, by offering a price, is essentially competing against himself tomorrow, because likely the price that will be offered tomorrow will be lower, and so therefore the seller today is facing competition by himself tomorrow. That's the logic of the Coase conjecture. Okay. Now, if the discount factor goes to 1, which means that there is very little discounting between today and tomorrow, then the competitor tomorrow is almost as strong as the seller today, meaning we have a strong competition. And if we have very strong competition between two sellers for a unit allocation of an object by a buyer whose value doesn't change. Okay, so we're thinking here about a persistent value that is given as private information once, but then doesn't change over time. So it's a very simple setting. Then strong competition means basically we have Bertrand pricing, which means that the lowest possible price that the seller can get today is simply the lowest possible valuation at which a sale can be guaranteed for sure. So pi, namely the revenue of the seller, is simply going to be the lowest possible type in the support of the distribution of the buyer, which is theta lower. Okay. Yes. Okay. And in fact, that's a result that Gould, Sonnenschein, and Wilson prove in that paper. Okay. As good. Okay. And this result is robust to many variations. Okay. So this highlights to you, and by means of this particular result, a formalization of the Coase conjecture, this highlights to you that indeed commitment is very important when we think about dynamic revenue maximization problem, because the Coase conjecture essentially told us in the absence of commitment, even the simplest dynamic allocation problem, where there's just one buyer, where the private information doesn't change over time, where we just need to allocate the object once, even in that simple setting, if we allow the seller to enter the mechanism without the ability to commit, his ability to extract revenue is minimal. And it is minimal because the same seller tomorrow is offering very effective competition for the same seller today. Okay, so this highlights the contrast that the role of commitment plays when we think or move from efficient allocation to revenue maximizing allocations. Okay, and I wanted for you to keep that in mind as we now go through a setting where we have commitment. Okay. And the setting where we have commitment is one where that is, for example, and was introduced by Courtney Lee. And as of course you realize I made a typo here. Lee is not spelled the American way, like General Lee, but is spelled I-L-I. Okay. It's also very nicely dealt with and introduced in the textbook by Tillman Burgers that I also refer to in the bibliography. Okay, so I want you to think about the following problem now. I want you to think about the simplest dynamic setting, namely one where we have just two periods. Okay, we want to think about two types of consumers who have to make a single purchase, namely a plane ticket for a fixed date of departure. Okay, and hopefully also a fixed date of arrival. The only thing that changes and makes this a dynamic mechanism is that the information about the value of the trip is accumulating over time. So what my true willingness to pay for the ticket is, my true value for the trip, that will become clear only to me in period 1. In period 0, I might have an estimate. Okay. And to make this problem interesting, and to have sort of an interesting answer for the efficient allocation already, we're going to assume that there's a marginal cost of filling that seat in the plane, and let that be C equal to 1. Okay. Yes. Okay. So this is now a dynamic maximization problem, actually a classic problem of revenue management, as it is practiced by a lot of the airlines and many other transportation companies. Okay, that is, they may want to sell their tickets early, they may want to sell it late, and the price of selling early versus late may well differ because the circumstances and the information that the buyers have about the demands may differ. Okay. Okay, I said there are going to be two types of travelers. They're going to be leisure travelers and business travelers. At time 0, the leisure travelers have a valuation that is distributed uniformly between 1 and 2, whereas the business travelers have a valuation that's distributed uniformly between 0, 1 and between 2 and 3. Okay. And the prior distribution is that leisure travelers are 1/3 of the entire travel population, and business travelers are 2/3 of the entire travel population. What are we trying to capture with this model here? Okay. First, you notice that if I mix leisure and business travelers, what I get is I get a uniform distribution between 0 and 3 for their values. Okay, so if I'm not trying to make a distinction between leisure travelers and business travelers, as if I'm going to try to sell just ticket at the very last moment and on the basis of their true willingness to pay, okay, then I simply have a uniform distribution between 0 and 3. Okay. On the other hand, if I'm thinking about, and that's sort of the sense in which we get more information, that is, at time 0, each one of our travelers know the type of traveler they are, but they don't know their exact valuation. Okay. At time 1, they will not only know which type of traveler they are, but they will also know their valuation. So that's the second aspect that is conveyed by this example, namely, one set of travelers have a higher variance in their willingness to pay, and therefore have a higher variance in their final valuation than the other. That is, leisure travelers are pretty certain about their valuation. For business traveler, it is either going to be an urgent trip when their valuation is high, or it's going to be a not so important trip when their valuation is low. Okay. And so at time T1, all the information is realized privately to the buyers. And we can ask ourselves, forget about the dynamic mechanism design, simply think about what we would do optimally if we were simply to wait until the very last moment and simply were to sell the price in period one. Sell the ticket in period one, or alternatively, if we were to set the prices as if we were to take as the aggregate distribution, the distribution between 0 and 3, and we're simply going to try to find the price that is optimal. Okay. In that case, the valuation in the market will be distributed between 0 and 3. Hence, the problem for the firm is simply to solve a static revenue maximization problem. Okay, and that is simply maximizing the net revenue, which is P minus C, times the probability that trade occurs. Okay, we have a uniform distribution between 0 and 3, so f of P can be simply given by 1/3 over P. Okay. And we can compute what the optimal price therefore is. Okay. Okay. And it's easy to see that the optimal price that comes from the first order condition is going to be 2. And the resulting revenues are going to be, or the resulting net revenues, the profit is going to be simply 1. Okay. Because I'm setting a price 2, I have to pay a cost of 1 for each unit sold. And I'm selling only to the business travelers, and I'm selling only to the business travelers who have a high valuation. Okay. So in this scheme, I basically eliminated all of the leisure travelers, and I also did not sell to the business travelers with low valuation. Yeah, good. Actually, let me just go back to the initial statement here of the model. And I want you to notice that the way I described it is basically something like a problem of third-degree price discrimination, right? On the one hand side, there are the leisure travelers. On the other hand, there are the business travelers, okay? If I had the ability somehow to segment the market between leisure travelers and business travelers, then I could, of course, pursue another pricing policy. But here we're going to assume that I don't have a priori the ability to segment the market. Maybe I could do this by offering different qualities. Think about business class versus economy class. Okay. But I don't have the ability. So the question is whether I can use time and the pricing policy as a means to screen. Okay. But it's closely related to a problem of third-degree price discrimination. And as an exercise, you may actually want to ask yourself, well, what could I achieve if I had to do third-degree price discrimination? Wonderful. Okay, and the second comment that I wanted to make before we go into is that we mentioned that the cost is 1, okay, of selling the good. So the efficient policy, therefore, the socially efficient policy would be to invite all the business travel to travel who have a high valuations, and would be to invite all of the leisure travelers to travel, and just exclude the business travelers with low valuation, because those have a willingness to pay that is below the marginal cost of providing the ticket. Okay. But if I just could sell an optimal pricing policy in the static market without the ability to segment and to differentiate between these two different segments, then not only will I exclude optimally the low value business travelers, but in fact, I will completely exclude the leisure travelers. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to think about what we could do if not only could we use as an instrument the simple price by which we sell the ticket in the final PAT equal 1, but if we had a way to segment the market endogenously between business travelers and leisure travelers. Okay. Here's another way to think about this problem. Okay. At time 0, we effectively have only two types. Okay. So if we think about incentive constraint, there are really just two incentive constraints, namely the one from the leisure traveler to the business traveler, and conversely from the business to the leisure traveler. At type t equal to 1, we have a lot of types, okay, namely a continuum between 0 and 3, and therefore we have a continuum of incentive constraints, okay, in fact a double continuum, right, because for every single type we have a continuum of incentive constraint, and so since we have a continuum of those, we have a double continuum. So informally, at least, what this tells us is that the problem is harder to solve for the monopolist when he faces all of these types as when he just faces initially two types. And by harder to solve, I don't mean necessarily that it's difficult to find the optimal price, because we just did that by means of just ordinary first order conditions. So there was nothing difficult there, but difficult in the sense that there are more constraints that needs respect, and therefore his objective function will face more constraint, and therefore we would expect there to be a lower revenue, since we will have to respect more incentive constraints. Okay. Good. So let's suppose that we can actually not only offer a price in period 1, but we can try to sell the tickets immediately at period 0, with perhaps some implications for the allocation and the price in period 1. Okay. So let me think about the following possible policy, and then I'm going to argue that indeed is the optimal policy. Okay, so let's suppose that the firm offers one price that is for leisure travelers, okay, and that price is trying to extract all of their surplus, which means I'm going to make a price that exactly equals to the expected value, which is 1.5. Okay, and then for the business traveler, I'm going to offer them a ticket at a higher price, okay? But I'm giving them the option for a refund if, in fact, the realized value in period 1 is low, okay? So how would that work? Okay, well, we now asking ourselves, how can we choose a price that all the business travelers buy the refundable price, but then half of them, namely the one who have a low valuation, are going to ask for a refund. Okay, and when we're setting these prices, okay, we're basically setting these prices in such a way that the business travelers, when thinking about the option that is being offered to them, want to accept that offer and do not try to mimic the consumer, do not try to mimic the leisure travelers. Okay, so if I were to accept that price, okay, then I'm thinking it should be the case that the expected value from that offer has to be larger than 0. Okay, that's simply the participation constraint. And so for the moment, let's just be concerned with the participation constraint, and then later on think about the incentive compatibility. Okay, so the participation constraint is that in expectation, I want it to be the case that the offer I'm going to make, okay, is higher than or at least equals to to 0. Okay. Now, I want them to accept the offer eventually if they turn out to have a high value. Okay. And I want them to return the ticket to me with a refund if they have a low value. Okay. So putting in the numbers, we get a simple expression in terms of the expected utility that just depends on the price that I'm paying for the ticket and the refund that I'm offering. Okay, and all that we're requiring is that that has to be bigger or equal than 0. Okay, and it's easy to see that this can be guaranteed by a price, and in fact means that we meeting the inequality precisely as an equality if we're charging a price of 1.75 for the entire ticket. Okay, but we're allowing them to return the ticket to us and get a refund of 1. Okay, with a refund of 1, okay, what are we guaranteeing? We're guaranteeing them that if they have a value less than 1, which they could of course realize since they have acquired the ticket unconditionally. Okay, so let me write this more. Okay, okay. We are requiring that, we basically giving them the right to return it efficiently. Okay, and we're also guaranteeing that they're willing to participate. Okay, and therefore, what do we find out? We find out that we get an ex-ante profit, not of 1/3, which we had before if we were just to sell it statically, but we can increase the profits. In fact, we can double the profits. We're getting it to 2/3. Okay. And we're extracting all of the surplus from the consumers. That is both from the leisure traveler as well as from the business travelers. Okay. Yes? Okay. Why does this work, you might ask? Well, in fact, before that, you might ask, well, what about the incentive constraint? Doesn't the high value, that is the business traveler, now have an incentive to try to pretend to be the leisure travelers? And the answer is no, because the price that we asked to the leisure travelers is exactly 3.5, which is also exactly the expected quality of the business travelers. So they have the same mean, but a different variance for their willingness to pay. So if we were to charge them an unconditional price of 1.5, then they would be left with 0 net utility, which is exactly their participation constraints, but happens to be also the value that comes from deviating and misreporting themselves for being leisure travelers rather than business travelers. So they don't want to do that. And what we have done is to basically offer the business travelers a contingent contract that allows them to back out in case they have a low value. That option, in turn, has no value for the leisure travelers because they will never have a value smaller than 1, but it has an option for the business travelers. So this option, in fact, allows us to separate the business traveler and the leisure traveler, yet extract all of the surplus and getting a profit of 2/3. Okay. Right. So we spoke about how difficult the problem is for the seller in the static version where we have a continuum of constraints. Okay. And how easy it is in the dynamic setting where we just initially have, at least at the interim level, that is when only the initial information about whether one is a business or leisure traveler is informed. We formulate it just in terms of the number of constraints, but we can also think about the sequence over time. That is, over time, as the buyers become more and more information, the incentive constraints multiply. Thus, we have more private information for the buyers. This private information inevitably leads to more information rent. okay, which means that the firm, the seller, has to concede more of the surplus to the buyers. And in the consequence, what we just proved, that it's actually strictly optimal to sell the object earlier, okay, even if it means that we giving some of the buyers right to return the ticket. And it's because we want to minimize the information. Okay. Here's a typo. Okay. Selling earlier, in fact, gives us less inefficient decisions. That's another important object here. That is, not only are we increasing the revenue of the seller by selling early, but by avoiding information rent and inefficiencies that come with the information rent, we actually get to more efficient decisions. Okay. And this is a trade-off that we will see again in dynamic mechanism design. Namely, that we want to anticipate the resolution of the uncertainty, the resolution of the allocation early, even if it means that we are in some sense making the decision before we have all the relevant decision information, because we're going to try to suppress the information and in favor of the revenue. Yeah. So you see that over these few lectures, we basically have developed a number of themes here. One is that price discrimination that now appears here in the form of intertemporal price discrimination, selling early rather than selling late, does not necessarily lead to less efficient allocation. Here we have an example where we get actually a more efficient allocation because we are succeeding to sell to both the high value business travelers, but also all of the leisure travelers. Okay. Second, in an attempt to control the information rent, okay, and in fact to attenuate, to lower the information rent, we may sometimes want to distort the timing and the nature of the allocation in order to get a better control on the information. And that's a problem that we already saw when we were trying to counter the winner's curse in the common value setting, and that we're now going to see in a different format, in different details, but pursuing similar logic here in the setting of sequential screening. Okay. Right. And notice that we need the commitment here, okay? Because if the seller did not have the ability to commit to the offer that we just outlined, namely a price of 1.5, 1.7, with the ability to return, okay? Then we would fail to sell at the appropriate price, okay? Very good. Why? Because I could wait as a business traveler. I could not take up the offer of the ticket with a refund. Okay, I could choose not to pay a price of 1.75, and I could rather wait until I'm entering into the situation when I buy the leisure ticket in the next period. Good. So this is our leading example that should have made us clear what are sort of some of the guiding principles in dynamic revenue maximization, and what are some of the insights that we get. We want to make decision if possible in the absence of information, and impossible in the absence of incentive constraint. Well, that will not be possible because often buyers will have some private information, but in terms of the direction, we want to distort it in making decision when they have less information. And so in a dynamic setting, that typically means earlier rather than later. When we do that, what we will see is that the optimal mechanism will typically lead to not only more revenue, but also more efficient decision, because we see less distortion in the allocation. Okay, and so what we're trying to do now is to basically see to what extent these insights can be generalized in the general setting that we set out in the beginning, beyond this very nice example of airline price discrimination and refund of tickets. Okay. Good. If there are no questions or concerns, then let me present you that setting. So we want to think about dynamic or sequential screening. What we will maintain here is, though, the language and the timing. That is, we want to think about initial types in period 0, and then continuation types or types at time 1. Okay, so today and tomorrow. These are, of course, the essential building blocks, even in a more complicated, in a richer, and in a longer time horizon, because at every point in time, I'm basically going to essentially think about a dynamic decision problem as one of making a decision today versus making a decision tomorrow. Okay, so we're going to have some initial types and some prior over those initial types. And after the initial types, we will get our final information, that's knowing what the true value is, and that will be the exposed distribution. Okay. As before in the airline example, the distribution of final types is going to come conditional on the initial information. Okay. And the utility that we're thinking of is simply utility that depends on the final quantity that a bidder gets and the final valuation willingness to pay. The simplest example that I invite you to think about is simply a linear utility. That is where the gross utility is simply my willingness to pay theta times the quantity, where the quantity can be thought of as a quality Q or as a quantity when we allow for randomized allocations. Okay? I should perhaps say that the exposition here will restrict itself, as in the airline section, to think about a single buyer who has one of possibly many types, both in terms of an initial types and an initial value. But much of the logic of these results here is extended to a setting where we have competing bidders or many bidders. Okay. And the logic really is, or the extension is really the same we saw in the static setting, namely the notion of a virtual utility there, which is central for the optimal monopoly pricing, has a very nice translation to many bidders, where we simply want to think about selling the object to the bidder who has the highest virtual utility. Okay. So in this setting, what is a direct mechanism? Well, a direct mechanism is simply a mapping from the initial information that we're eliciting, from the final information that we're eliciting into the quantity, and then into a price that we're asking the bidder to pay. Okay. Now we want to think about incentive compatibility formally. Okay. So now we have to account for the fact that we're thinking about more information arriving over time, and therefore more incentive compatibilities to rise. Okay, so we're asking the bidder or the agent to reveal this information in period 0 and in period 1. Let's do backward deduction. Let's do recursion. And so after having reported in the past a type theta prime when his true type was theta, we now want to say that it's better for you to report. After having reported in the past his initial type tau, where for the moment we don't make any claim what that initial type was, okay, whether it was reported truthfully or not, we now want to say it is better to report your true willingness theta rather than to report any other willingness to pay, and that's theta prime. Okay. Notice, by the way, that the initial report tau, may affect the allocation probability Q. It may affect the monetary transfer T, but it doesn't affect the utility function in the sense of determining what the value is. That is going to be given by my true willingness to pay theta alone. Okay? So this is the incentive compatibility exposed. This is the incentive compatibility in the second period. Okay? What's the incentive compatibility in the first period? Well, that now is to say we need to be sure that even in the initial period, I have an incentive to report truthfully. That is, I'm going to report tau, okay, which is the first line of the inequality, rather than tau prime, which is coming with the second inequality. And here's where we have the additional complication that comes in dynamic mechanism design. When we think about the deviation in the initial period, that is tau prime, not only should we think about allowing for a deviation in the initial period, I should also allow the agent to think about, given that he deviated and given that the deviation is unobservable to all the other agents, what is the optimal strategy thereafter? And so thereafter, it's far from obvious that he should report truthfully, and therefore we need to specify a whole contingent mapping, theta r, that tells me what I'm going to report as a function of my true willingness to pay in the next period. Okay? And to be complete and consistent, this mapping, okay, this strategy should also depend on the particular misreport tau prime that I'm planning. Okay? Right? Good. This inequality that we now displaying, what you notice is that this is formed as an integral, therefore as an expectation over all possible willingness to pay that may arrive in the second period. Okay, so there's a lot of information that the agent himself doesn't know. But what he does know is that in the initial period, his type is tau, and so therefore he can use the conditional expectation to form the expectation both what would happen on the equilibrium path when he reports truthfully and off the equilibrium path when he doesn't report truthfully. Okay? Okay. These are the incentive constraints. And then, of course, we have the participation constraints. Okay, so here we're going to just insist on an ex-ante notion of the incentive constraint that is, given my initial information tau and taking the expectation over all possible realizations theta in the future, I want it to be the case that the expected utility that I'm getting as an agent from the interaction with the principal has to be non-negative. Okay. It's actually an interesting question, an important question for many real-life mechanism design problems, whether one can weaken this participation constraint to not only hold an expectation, but holds realization by realization in an ex-post notion. But we don't. Well, let's not pursue that here today. Okay. Okay, but that's just to say there are choices here to make in the nature of the incentive constraints that we are going to think about. Okay. So we highlighted that there might be double deviations, okay, that is deviations that think both in terms of misreporting today and making subsequent misreports. Well, the nice aspect of this setting here, but of this particular setting, is that we can disregard those double deviation. And why can we disregard those double deviation? Well, it is because in the second period, or in particular in the evaluation of the utility that we get from the allocation, all that matters is the final willingness to pay theta. And the prior information that came through the type theta does not matter anymore. Theta, not theta, theta, but tau, I meant to say, okay? All the prior information that came to the type tau does not matter anymore. Everything that matters is encoded in theta, and therefore it will be sufficient to think just about simple deviation, namely misreporting my initial type, but then guaranteeing myself that in the future I'm reporting truthfully, right? That's a property of our formulation of how much information is contained in the final bit of information, the theta. And that will help us here, and that helped Courtney Lee. But I should point out to you that to the extent that the entire sequence of signals matter for the evaluation at the end, we will have to be concerned about this double deviation constraints. Okay? And so what this means is that the exposed incentive constraints, okay, can be integrated to replace the double deviations. Okay? And what we're now trying to do is to find sufficient condition on the allocation for incentive compatibility. Okay. And in fact, we will see that assuming monotonicity or guaranteeing monotonicity in the allocation in period 2 alone will be a sufficient condition. Okay. It's not a necessary condition. Okay. And so the characterization of the optimal mechanism here is going to be less tight and less complete in some sense than one would typically find in a static environment, okay? And we can strengthen the sufficient condition to become a necessary condition if we assume a first-order stochastic dominance condition, okay? And so the first-order stochastic dominance condition basically means that higher types in the sense of initial information have higher expected utility. And if that is satisfied, then indeed we can, for any monotonic allocation, then the sufficient condition also becomes a necessary condition. And that is indeed the condition that Courtney and Lee pursued. Okay. And with this monotonicity condition, we can then guarantee a participation constraints holding as an equality only for the lowest possible type. And so now we basically can roll up the first order conditions again to obtain an expression for the virtual utility just as before. Okay. What is the virtual utility that we then get? Okay. So I mentioned that we're going to restrict attention here to just simply the quadratic expression theta times q for the gross utility of the agent, and we're thinking about q just being the probability of getting the object. Okay. Then we can describe the marginal return to selling, that is the virtual utility in this dynamic setting, as an expression that is quite familiar from us from the static model, but augmented to account for the dynamic effect. Okay. Why? Well, let's look at psi here, which is the virtual utility in this two-period allocation problem. That is simply the utility of the agent theta minus the inverse hazard rate, which is the expression 1 minus capital G over small g. Okay. So far, so good. That's what we would get in the static world, but in the dynamic world, we have to account that the information rent that we're getting in the initial period 0 comes to the fact that it informs us about what is the likely type that we have in the future. And so that's the second ratio, okay, and that basically describes locally what's the informativeness for every type that the initial information has about the final willingness to pay. Okay. And this expression that looks a little bit abstract here, which is basically saying to what extent is the conditional probability distribution over the final willingness to pay impacted by the initial information, which captured the initial information of this signal, okay, is an expression that when we rewrite it, basically is similar to the impulse response that we get in models for time series, okay? And that often has, in particular, once we describe the distribution function, say it's being a normal distribution function, has a very nice explicit answer, okay? Okay, and so the final result that I want to talk to you about is that description of the optimal mechanism that can, in fact, be given completely on the basis of this virtual utility. So the optimal mechanism in the setting of quarterly is to think about a price that I'm charging for a transaction, okay, for every theta and every initial type that is met by any bidder who has a final willingness to pay theta that has a non-negative virtual utility. Okay, good. And so the optimal mechanism is to sell to all those types, okay, and to charge a price, an upfront price that can be computed in order to meet the incentive constraint, and an ex post price that is necessary to support the efficient transaction evaluated at the basis of the virtual utility. And that will give us the generalization of the refund policy that we had before to general types and general allocation problems. Okay. So let me end with this. If you see the slides go on for a little while longer, and they basically extend the logic of this argument by going through results that were developed by Marco Battaglini for an infinite horizon monopoly problem. Those are very nice results, and then I'm going to point out how one can get more general necessary and sufficient condition. And here a paper by Pavan, Siegel, and Teuker was very influential, as well as a new argument that Peter Esser and Balazs Centers provided in 2007. So these are sort of the next steps to take, but that's quite a bit of material, and we don't need to cover this today. And in fact, we don't need to talk about this today, but it gives you an idea that many of the powerful insights that we derived from the static mechanism have a very nice and interesting translation into a dynamic setting. And so the tools that we develop from the static environment find a nice and compelling translation into dynamic environments. Okay. And with that, let me end this lecture. So that was hopefully as much a joy in a very compressed amount of time for you as it was for me to present you these results that are really highlights, I think, of what theory has done in the last 10 or maybe last 20 years. I hope that the material is interesting, if not even exciting for you. And so as you go on, I hope that you find further use for this material. If you have any questions, of course, Emmanuel, Peter, and I are happy to address. In particular, I should have some responsibility for this material, so feel free to email me. I guess that's the easiest way to communicate. And if you want to stay up tonight a little bit to watch the election results, which are hopefully going to be much better than 4 years ago, which was a shocker for all of us, do so. But otherwise, enjoy your Tuesday evening. Okay, great. Thank you.